The escape pod screamed through the atmosphere of Kepler 442c like a dying star, its hull glowing white-hot as friction tore away layers of ablative shielding. Inside, Commander Zara Tex Valen of the Altarian Survey Corps fought to remain conscious as G-forces that would have liquefied most organic beings pressed against her reinforced exoskeleton. Her forearms worked frantically across the emergency controls, her elongated fingers dancing over interfaces designed for crisis situations exactly like this one. The main colony ship Prosperity's Dawn was gone. 3 days ago, it had been humanity's newest deep space partner vessel, carrying joint human-Altarian crews to establish the first truly integrated settlement beyond the Terran sphere. Now it was nothing but expanding debris and frozen corpses, victim to a reactor cascade failure that the emergency systems had failed to prevent. Zara had been in the environmental lab when the first explosion rocked the ship, analyzing soil samples from their destination world. She'd had perhaps 30 seconds to reach the nearest escape pod before the hull breach reached her section. 30 seconds to grab whatever supplies she could carry. 30 seconds to input emergency coordinates. 30 seconds to accept that everyone she'd worked with for the past 2 years was dead, including the 12 humans who had become closer to her than her own clutch siblings back on Altair Prime. The pod's collision warning system blared in 3 different languages as the surface of Kepler 442c rushed up to meet her. Zara's compound eyes tracked the readouts, her analytical mind processing the terrible mathematics of survival even as her emotional centers reeled with grief and shock. Atmospheric composition, breathable for most oxygen-based species, though with higher CO2 levels than ideal. Surface temperature, -42 degrees Celsius. At her projected landing site, local time, approximately 3 hours before the onset of a planetary night cycle that would last 16 standard hours. The emergency beacon in her pod would broadcast for perhaps 72 hours before its power cells died. The nearest rescue station was a full parsec away, and with the destruction of the Prosperity's Dawn, no one would even know to look for survivors until the ship failed to report in at the next scheduled check-in. That was still 8 days away. She was going to die on this frozen rock, alone and forgotten. The impact came with the sound of tearing metal and the sharp crack of her harness, straining against forces it was never designed to handle. The pod bounced once, twice, then skidded across what felt like rough stone for several hundred meters before finally coming to rest against something solid. Emergency lighting bathed the cramped interior in hellish red, and the acrid smell of burning electronics filled the recycled air. Zara hung motionless in her harness for several long moments, taking inventory of her body. Her secondary left arm throbbed where it had been wrenched against the restraints, but the pain was manageable. Her exoskeleton had done its job, distributing the impact forces across her entire frame rather than allowing them to concentrate at vulnerable joints. She was bruised, shaken, but essentially intact. The same could not be said for her escape pod. The main control console sparked and died as she watched, taking with it her only means of monitoring the beacon's transmission status. The environmental systems wheezed and rattled, working far harder than they should have been to maintain pressure and atmosphere. Somewhere behind the rear bulkhead, she could hear the steady drip of some vital fluid leaking onto the deck plating. She triggered her harness release and drifted forward in the low gravity, her magnetic boot soles clicking against the deck plating as they engaged. The pod's small viewport had survived the impact, though it was now spider-webbed with stress fractures. Through it, she could see a landscape that matched the pre-mission briefings perfectly. Endless expanses of grey-black rock punctuated by twisted formations that might once have been trees, all under a sky the color of old blood. Kepler 442c had been classified as marginal for terraforming efforts. The atmosphere was breathable but thin, the gravity was manageable at roughly 80% of Terran standard, and the day-night cycle was regular if lengthy. What made it problematic was the ecosystem, or rather, the lack thereof. Whatever catastrophe had befallen this world in the distant past had left it essentially sterile, a rocky wasteland with only the most basic bacterial life clinging to existence in scattered pockets. It was the kind of world that colonization efforts usually passed over in favor of more promising candidates, the kind of world that served as nothing more than a refueling stop or emergency way station, the kind of world where dying alone was not just possible but probable. Zara began her systematic inventory of supplies, working with the methodical precision that had made her one of the youngest commanders in Survey Corps history. The emergency kit yielded a basic medical scanner, water purification tablets, high-energy food concentrates sufficient for perhaps 10 days, and a thermal shelter that could keep her alive in the planet's bitter cold for maybe twice that long if she was careful. The pod's fabrication unit had been damaged in the crash but might still be functional enough to produce basic tools or repair materials. Most importantly, she found the emergency beacon still intact and broadcasting. Its small display indicated that it was operating within normal parameters, sending out the standard distress signal every 30 minutes across all major communication frequencies. Help was coming, theoretically. She just had to survive long enough for it to arrive. She was sealing the last of the food concentrates back into their storage container when she heard it. A sound that shouldn't have existed on a dead world. Footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate footsteps crunching across the rocky ground outside her damaged pod. Zara froze, her compound eyes focusing on the fractured viewport. The pre-mission briefings had been very clear about Kepler 442c's status. No indigenous intelligent life. No previous colonization attempts. The only recorded visits had been 3 automated survey missions, all of which had reported the same thing: a sterile, lifeless rock, suitable only for emergency use. The footsteps stopped directly outside her pod. For several heartbeats, nothing moved except the steady rise and fall of Zara's breathing apparatus. Then, with deliberate care, something knocked on the hull of her escape pod. 3 measured impacts, pause, then 3 more. The universal signal for peaceful contact. Zara's training warred with her instincts. First contact protocols demanded caution, extensive sensor sweeps, careful establishment of communication parameters. But she was injured, stranded, and running on emergency power. If whoever was outside meant her harm, there was little she could do to prevent it. If they meant to help, she activated the pod's external speakers with one of her secondary hands while keeping her primary arms free. "This is Commander Zareth Valen of the Altarian Survey Corps," she said, speaking in standard galactic and hoping her translator protocols were still functioning. "I am a survivor of a spacecraft disaster. Please identify yourself." The reply came in accented but perfectly understandable standard galactic. "My name is Marcus Chen, formerly Staff Sergeant, Terran Colonial Marines. Currently just a guy trying to make it through another day on this frozen piece of space junk. I heard your beacon and figured somebody might need help." A human. There was a human on this supposedly uninhabited world, and he was offering assistance. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Zara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am in need of assistance. My escape pod is damaged and my supplies are limited. But I must ask, what is your status on this world?" The pre-mission surveys indicated no sentient life. A sound that might have been laughter came through the speakers. "Well, Commander, that depends on how you define sentient. I've been here about 6 months, and some days I'm not so sure about my own qualifications in that department. But if you're asking whether I'm authorized to be here, the answer is no. I'm what you might call an unofficial resident." Zara processed this information quickly. A human military veteran stranded on Kepler 442c for 6 months, surviving somehow in conditions that should have been lethal within days. Either he was lying about his circumstances, or humans were even more adaptable than their reputation suggested. "Can you assist with repairs to my vessel?" she asked. "I can take a look, but from what I can see through your viewport, you're not going anywhere in that pod. The good news is that you don't have to freeze to death out here while we figure out our next move. I've got a shelter about 2 clicks from here, insulated, heated, and stocked with enough supplies to keep us both alive for quite a while. Us." He had said "us," as if her survival was already a given, as if helping her was the most natural thing in the galaxy. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Zara said carefully. "Forgive my directness, but I must ask. What do you want in exchange for this assistance?" The pause that followed was long enough that she began to worry her communication system had failed. When the human finally replied, his voice carried a tone she couldn't quite identify, sadness perhaps, or maybe something deeper. "Commander, I've been alone on this rock for 6 months. The last intelligent conversation I had was with my ship's AI before she finally degraded beyond repair. I've talked to rocks, I've talked to the wind, and I've had entire debates with my own shadow just to hear another voice. What I want is simple. I want to help another living being survive, because that's what we do. That's what makes us different from the rocks and the wind and the shadows." Zara stared at the fractured viewport, trying to process what she was hearing. In her experience, offers of assistance always came with conditions, negotiations, exchanges of favor for favor. It was the foundation of interspecies diplomacy, the basic principle that governed interactions between different civilizations. And yet this human was offering help with no apparent expectation of return, as if altruism toward complete strangers was simply natural. I will accept your offer of assistance, she said finally. However, I should warn you that I am not entirely certain when rescue might arrive. It could be days or weeks. Commander, with all due respect, nobody's coming to look for you, at least not anytime soon. The words hit her like a physical blow. Explain. Your beacon's been broadcasting for about 4 hours now. I've been monitoring emergency frequencies since I got here, and I can tell you that there's no regular traffic through this system. This isn't a shipping lane or a patrol route. The only reason I'm here is because my transport had a critical systems failure, and this was the nearest world where I could set down without dying immediately. If you're here, it's because something went very, very wrong. Zara closed her compound eyes, processing the implications. If Chen was correct, then her situation was even worse than she had calculated. No regular traffic meant no chance of detection by passing vessels. No patrol routes meant no military search parties. She was truly stranded, dependent on whenever the Survey Corps noticed that the Prosperity's Dawn had failed to report and decided to investigate. That could be weeks or months. However, Chen continued, his voice brightening slightly. The good news is that this rock is survivable if you know what you're doing. I've spent the last 6 months figuring out how to make it work, and I'm willing to share what I've learned. We can keep each other alive until rescue arrives, however long that takes. There it was again. That casual assumption that her welfare was his responsibility, that helping her was simply what any decent being would do. Zara had studied human psychology as part of her xenobiology training, but the reality of experiencing their legendary compassion firsthand was profoundly unsettling. In Altarian culture, such automatic altruism was reserved for clutch siblings and mating partners. Extending it to complete strangers, especially aliens, was practically unheard of. Staff Sergeant Chen, she said, I accept your offer. However, I must retrieve certain equipment from my pod before departing. Roger that, Commander. Take your time. I'll start prepping a route to my shelter while you gather what you need. Fair warning, though, it's going to be a bit of a hike, and the local weather's not exactly friendly to biological systems. Zara began collecting her essential supplies, working quickly but methodically. The medical scanner, water purification equipment, food concentrates, and her personal sidearm went into a portable kit designed for EVA operations. She hesitated over the beacon, then decided to leave it running. Even if Chen was right about the lack of traffic, there was always the possibility that someone might pick up the signal. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the human's casual mention of being a former colonial marine. Terran military personnel were legendary throughout the galaxy for their effectiveness in combat, but they were equally well known for their strict codes of honor and their tendency to extend protection to non-combatants regardless of species. If Chen truly was what he claimed to be, then she might have found the one person in the galaxy most qualified to help her survive her current situation. She was sealing her kit when she heard his voice again through the external speakers. Commander, whenever you're ready. I should mention that local nightfall is about 2 hours away, and the temperature drops pretty dramatically once the sun goes down. We want to be safely inside well before that happens. Zara activated the pod's emergency release sequence, pressurizing the small airlock chamber that would allow her to exit safely. As the inner door sealed behind her, she realized that she was about to place her life entirely in the hands of a human she had never seen, whose presence on this world made no sense according to official records, whose motivations remained largely mysterious. And yet, as the outer door cycled open, and the thin, cold air of Kepler 442c filled her breathing apparatus, she felt something that had been absent since the moment the Prosperity's Dawn exploded. Hope. The figure waiting for her outside the pod was unmistakably human, though heavily modified for survival in hostile environments. He stood about average height for his species, perhaps 1.8 meters, but his environmental suit was clearly military-grade and extensively customized. Heating elements were visible along the major joint lines, and additional armor plating had been welded over critical areas. His helmet's faceplate was polarized against the harsh local sunlight, but she could see enough of his features to confirm that he appeared to be of East Asian descent, probably Chinese or Korean based on his facial structure. What struck her most immediately was his posture, relaxed but alert, confident without being aggressive. This was someone who had spent considerable time in dangerous situations and had learned to project calm authority even in the midst of crisis. Commander Thex Valen, he said, inclining his head in a gesture that might have been either a military salute or a polite bow. Welcome to scenic Kepler 442c, where the weather's terrible, the scenery's worse, and the company's been seriously lacking until now. Despite everything, Zara found herself making the Altarian gesture equivalent to a smile. Staff Sergeant Chen. I confess I am grateful for your presence here, however unexpected it might be. Marcus is fine, Commander. We're going to be roommates for the foreseeable future. No point standing on ceremony. He shouldered a pack that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and salvage, then gestured toward a barely visible path leading away from the crash site. Shall we? It's about an hour's walk to Home Sweet Home, and I'd like to get there before this place starts trying to freeze us solid. As they began walking across the desolate landscape, Zara found herself studying her rescuer more carefully. His movements were efficient and economical. Someone who had learned to conserve energy in an environment where every calorie mattered. He navigated the treacherous footing with the unconscious skill of someone who had walked this route many times before. Most telling of all, he maintained a constant scan of their surroundings, his head moving in regular patterns that suggested trained paranoia rather than casual observation. "Marcus," she said as they picked their way between two massive boulder formations, "may I ask how you came to be stranded on this world?"
He was quiet for several steps before answering.
"Bad luck, mostly. I was part of a small survey team, strictly off the books, investigating some unusual readings in this system. Our ship had a cascade failure in the jump drive, same as what probably happened to your vessel. We managed to make it to the surface, but the crash killed my two teammates and left me with a ship that was never going to fly again. I am sorry for your loss. Thank you. They were good people." He paused to help her navigate around a particularly treacherous patch of loose stone. "What about you, Commander? What brings Survey Corps this far out into the middle of nowhere?" Zara briefly explained the joint colonization mission and the disaster that had befallen the Prosperity's dawn. As she spoke, she noticed that Marcus listened with the complete attention that marked a trained military professional. He asked no questions during her account, but she could see him processing the information, filing away details that might prove relevant later. "Reactor cascade failure," he said when she finished. "That's a hell of a way to go. Quick, at least. Better than what happened to the survey teams that tried to establish outposts here before." Zara's steps faltered. Previous survey teams? The official records indicated that this world had never been visited except by automated probes. Marcus glanced back at her, his expression unreadable behind his faceplate. "Commander, there's a lot about this place that didn't make it into the official records. That's actually part of why I'm here. But that conversation can wait until we're somewhere warm with something hot to drink. One crisis at a time." They walked the rest of the distance in companionable silence, Marcus occasionally pointing out hazards or interesting geological formations. Zara used the time to observe their surroundings more carefully, trying to understand how this world had managed to sustain human life for 6 months when it had been classified as barely habitable. The answer became apparent when they crested a low ridge and Marcus's shelter came into view. What she had expected to be a basic survival lean-to or emergency prefab was instead a sophisticated compound that looked like it had been built to last for years rather than months. The main structure was clearly constructed from salvaged ship components, but it had been reinforced with local materials and expanded well beyond its original specifications. Solar collectors gleamed on the roof, and she could see the distinctive shimmer of an atmospheric processor working to create a pocket of more breathable air around the complex. "Home sweet home," Marcus said. And for the first time since her escape pod had screamed through the atmosphere, Zara began to believe that she might actually survive this ordeal. The interior of Marcus's shelter defied everything Zara had been taught about survival in hostile environments. Where she had expected cramped quarters and barely functional life support, she found a space that was not just livable but genuinely comfortable. The main room was spacious enough for both of them to move around freely, with a ceiling high enough that she didn't feel claustrophobic despite her greater height. The walls were lined with salvage panels from what had clearly been a much larger vessel, but they had been arranged with an eye for both function and aesthetics. More importantly, the temperature inside was a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius, and her breathing apparatus registered an atmosphere that was not just breathable, but actually richer in oxygen than the thin air outside. The atmospheric processor, she had noticed, was doing more than just basic air recycling. It was actively terraforming the immediate environment around the shelter. "How is this possible?" she asked, removing her environmental helmet and breathing unfiltered air for the first time since her crash. The power requirements alone should be enormous. Marcus was sealing the airlock door behind them, cycling through decontamination procedures that suggested he had been taking planetary safety very seriously. "That's the beautiful thing about having 6 months to work on a project," he said, hanging his own helmet on a rack that had clearly been crafted from spare parts. "When you're stuck somewhere with nothing but time and salvage, you get creative." He led her through the main living area, pointing out features as they went. The power came from a hybrid system that combined solar collection with geothermal taps, taking advantage of Kepler FR2c's high internal heat to provide consistent energy even during the long night cycles. Water was recycled through a system that would have been impressive on a starship, let alone a survival shelter. Food production came from a hydroponic garden that occupied most of what had once been a cargo bay. The atmospheric processor was the hardest part, Marcus explained as they passed through a corridor lined with equipment that hummed quietly but efficiently. I had to cannibalize half my ship's environmental systems to make it work, but once I got it running, everything else became manageable. Clean air, stable temperature, enough power for lighting and communication equipment. Zara paused beside a workbench where several pieces of obviously alien technology were arranged in various stages of disassembly. The components were unlike anything she had ever seen. Crystalline structures that seemed to shift and flow, even while remaining perfectly solid. Marcus, what are these? His expression grew carefully neutral. That's part of the longer conversation I mentioned earlier. The reason this place isn't in any official records, despite the fact that it's obviously been visited before. He gestured toward a seating area that had been constructed around what appeared to be a salvaged ship's observation deck. Why don't you get settled and I'll put together something hot to eat while I explain what I found here. As Marcus worked in what passed for a kitchen, Zara examined their living space more carefully. The attention to detail was extraordinary. He had created not just a survival shelter, but a genuine home, complete with personal touches that spoke of someone who had accepted that his stay here might be indefinite. Books on physical media, something that was becoming increasingly rare in an age of digital storage. A collection of small sculptures carved from local stone. Even what appeared to be a musical instrument, though of a design she didn't recognize. You've been planning to stay here permanently, she said. It wasn't a question. Not planning exactly, but preparing for the possibility. Marcus returned with 2 steaming cups of what smelled like genuine coffee, an incredible luxury given their circumstances. I've had 6 months to think about this situation, and the math isn't encouraging. The kind of ship I'd need to get off this rock doesn't just happen by. And even if one did, there are complications. Zara accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring both the warmth and the caffeine. What kind of complications? Marcus settled into a chair across from her, cradling his own cup in both hands. Commander, what do you know about the Kepler 442 systems history? Standard astronomical data, G-type star, approximately 4.7 billion years old, 7 planets with 3 in the habitable zone. This world is the middle planet of the 3. Marginally suitable for terraforming but classified as low priority due to the lack of indigenous life and marginal resource availability. That's the official story, yes, but it's not the whole story. Marcus gestured toward the alien components on his workbench. About 3 months after I got here, I started finding things. Ruins, mostly. Nothing obvious, nothing that would show up on orbital surveys, but definitely artificial. This planet wasn't always the lifeless rock it appears to be today. Zara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the external temperature. You're suggesting there was a previous civilization here? I'm not suggesting it, Commander. I'm stating it as fact. There was a highly advanced species living on this world, probably within the last 10,000 years. They had technology that makes our best efforts look like stone tools. And something killed them all. The implications were staggering. If Marcus was correct, then Kepler 442c represented not just a missed opportunity for colonization, but a potential threat of unknown magnitude. Advanced civilizations didn't just disappear without cause, and whatever had been powerful enough to destroy a technological species might still be present in the system. What evidence do you have to support this theory, she asked, falling back on scientific training to maintain objectivity in the face of extraordinary claims. Marcus stood and walked to a storage cabinet, returning with what appeared to be a datapad of unfamiliar design. The screen flickered to life as he approached, displaying what looked like topographical maps overlaid with archaeological notation. I've identified 17 distinct sites within a 50-kilometer radius of this shelter, he said, manipulating the display to show her various locations. All of them show signs of artificial construction, though most have been weathered almost beyond recognition. The largest site is about 30 clicks to the north. That's where I found most of the intact technology samples. The maps were detailed beyond anything she would have expected from a single person working alone. Marcus, this represents months of systematic survey work. How did you manage such comprehensive coverage? I had time, motivation, and military training in reconnaissance operations. Plus, I needed something to keep me busy, or I was going to go insane from isolation. He switched the display to show photographic evidence. Partially excavated structures, tool fragments, and those mysterious crystalline components. But the really interesting part isn't what I found, it's what found me. Zara looked up from the datapad sharply. Explain. About 2 months ago, I started noticing that some of my equipment was being modified. Small changes, usually improvements. My solar collectors became more efficient. My water recycling system started producing purer output than it was designed for. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then I started finding tools in places I hadn't left them, always arranged to be maximally useful for whatever project I was working on. The scientific part of Zara's mind immediately began formulating hypotheses. You believe you're experiencing contact with surviving members of the previous civilization? I believe something on this planet is watching me, learning from me, and trying to help me survive. Whether that something is a remnant of the previous inhabitants, some kind of automated system they left behind, or something else entirely, I haven't been able to determine. Zara studied the evidence Marcus had compiled, her trained mind automatically cataloging inconsistencies and gaps in the data. What she saw was compelling but incomplete, the kind of preliminary findings that would normally trigger a full archaeological expedition. Have you attempted direct communication with these entities? I've tried everything I can think of. Radio broadcasts across the spectrum, mathematical sequences, visual displays, even musical compositions. If they're listening, they're not responding through conventional channels. But the helpful modifications to my equipment have continued, and they've become more sophisticated over time. Marcus activated another section of his display, showing technical schematics that made Zara's eyes widen with surprise. The modifications he described weren't simple improvements. They represented fundamental advances in engineering that should have been beyond the capabilities of any known technology.
Marcus, these designs, they're revolutionary.
The power efficiency ratios alone would transform interstellar travel. If this technology could be reproduced, I know. That's part of the complication I mentioned earlier. This planet isn't just a survival situation anymore. It's potentially the most important archaeological discovery in galactic history, and I'm the only one who knows about it. Zara set down her coffee cup, her mind racing through the implications. You haven't reported any of this to Colonial Command? With what communication array? My ship's transmitter was damaged in the crash, and I don't have the materials to repair it. Even if I did, sending a message to Colonial Command about this would trigger a full military investigation. This planet would be crawling with survey teams, archaeologists, and probably a few intelligence operatives within a month. That's not necessarily a bad thing if the discoveries here are as significant as you suggest. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. Commander, in my experience, when the military gets interested in alien technology, bad things tend to happen. Especially when that technology is advanced beyond our current understanding. Zara recognized the tone. She had heard it from other military veterans, usually when discussing classified operations that had gone wrong. You have personal experience with first contact situations? More than I'd prefer to remember. The Colonial Marines don't just fight human separatists and pirates, Commander. We also handle situations where civilian populations encounter things they're not equipped to deal with. Alien artifacts, abandoned technology, sometimes actual living species that don't want to be studied. The implications of what he was telling her were profound. If Marcus was correct about both the archaeological significance of this world and the likely response from military authorities, then her crash had deposited her in the middle of a situation with galaxy-spanning ramifications. What do you propose we do? She asked. Honestly, I was hoping you might have some ideas. Your Survey Corps, which means you have experience with first contact protocols and archaeological preservation. You probably have a better understanding than I do of how to handle discoveries like this responsibly. Zara considered the problem from multiple angles. The scientific value of the ruins was undeniable, but Marcus's concerns about military intervention were also valid. Throughout galactic history, whenever advanced alien technology had been discovered, the results had been unpredictable at best and catastrophic at worst. The vegan incident 12 years ago had resulted in the complete sterilization of an inhabited world when archaeologists had accidentally activated a dormant weapon system. There may be a middle path, she said finally. Survey Corps has protocols for handling sensitive archaeological sites. If I could convince my superiors that this world requires careful study rather than immediate exploitation, it might be possible to establish a proper research station while maintaining security precautions. And if they decide that the military applications of the technology are more important than the archaeological ones.
It was a valid concern, and one that Zara couldn't dismiss easily.
She had seen how quickly scientific missions could become militarized when the stakes were high enough. Then we'll have to hope that 6 months of building a relationship with whatever intelligence is modifying your equipment will give us some influence over how that technology is shared. Marcus stood and walked to one of the windows that looked out over the alien landscape. The sun was setting, painting the rocky formations in shades of deep red and purple. There's something else, Commander. Something I haven't told you yet. What is it? The modifications to my equipment haven't just been improvements to existing systems. 3 weeks ago, I woke up to find a completely new device sitting on my workbench. Something that definitely wasn't built from ship salvage or local materials. Zara felt her pulse quicken. What kind of device? Marcus walked to a secured storage container and withdrew something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was clearly technological, but unlike any technology she had ever seen, the device appeared to be constructed from the same crystalline material as the archaeological samples, that this was obviously functional rather than ancient. It pulsed with a soft blue-white light that seemed to come from deep within its structure. I have no idea what it does, Marcus said, holding the device carefully. I've run every scan I can think of, and it doesn't match any known technology in my databases. But it's warm to the touch, it responds to proximity by increasing its luminosity, and sometimes I swear I can hear it humming. Zara extended one of her hands toward the device, stopping just short of contact. As her palm approached the crystalline surface, the light within intensified noticeably. It's responding to me as well. Have you attempted to activate it? I've been afraid to. Unknown alien technology has a habit of doing exactly what you don't expect it to do, often with lethal results. But now that there are 2 of us here, he looked at her with an expression that was part hope and part apprehension. Maybe it's time to find out what our mysterious benefactors are trying to tell us. The device continued to pulse in response to their proximity, its light growing stronger and more rhythmic. As Zara watched, she began to perceive patterns in the luminescence, sequences that repeated and evolved like some form of visual language. Marcus, she said softly. I think it's trying to communicate with us. Outside the shelter, night was falling over Kepler. 442, see with the swift finality that characterized worlds with thin atmospheres. But inside, 2 strangers who had found each other across the vast emptiness of space, prepared to take the first steps toward a discovery that would reshape their understanding of intelligence, survival, and what it truly meant to be alone in the universe. The device pulsed once more, brighter than before, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the shelter's walls, something ancient and patient began to stir in response to their presence. The device activated at the moment both Zara and Marcus touched its crystalline surface simultaneously. There was no dramatic surge of energy, no blinding flash of light, just a gentle warmth that spread through their hands and up their arms like sunlight through water. The shelter around them shimmered and became translucent, though they could still feel the solid floor beneath their feet and the comfortable temperature of the recycled air. What surrounded them now was Kepler, 442c as it had been 10,000 years ago. Instead of barren rock and endless grey stone, they stood in the middle of a vast garden that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Crystalline spires rose from groves of trees that resembled no species in any xenobotanical database. Their branches heavy with fruit that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Streams of clear water wound between flowering meadows, where creatures that might have been birds, or insects, or something entirely unprecedented, danced in complex patterns through air that sparkled with what looked like living stars. This is impossible, Zara whispered, though she made no move to break contact with the device. We're experiencing some form of historical playback, but the detail level is beyond anything I've ever seen. Every blade of grass, every grain of pollen in the air, every shadow cast by the trees. This isn't a recording. It's a complete reconstruction of an entire ecosystem. Marcus was turning slowly, taking in the scope of what they were seeing. Commander, look at the city. Where his shelter had been moments before, a metropolis rose from the living landscape, like a natural extension of the garden itself. The architecture was organic, flowing, structures that seemed to have been grown rather than built. Spires twisted skyward in helical patterns that followed no human understanding of engineering, yet somehow projected a sense of perfect stability and enduring strength. Bridges made of what appeared to be living wood spanned the spaces between buildings, while vehicles that moved like schools of fish navigated aerial pathways with silent grace. And everywhere, moving through the city and the gardens beyond with unhurried purpose, were the builders of this paradise. They were tall, perhaps 2.5 meters in height, with limbs that seemed to shift between solid and translucent as they moved. Their faces were delicate and angular, with features that suggested intelligence and emotional depth. What struck Zara most powerfully was their obvious contentment. These beings moved through their world with the easy confidence of a species that had achieved perfect harmony with their environment. "They're beautiful," she said, watching a group of the creatures tending to plants that reached toward them like pets seeking attention. "They've solved everything. Energy, food production, environmental management, population control. This is a true post-scarcity civilization." "Was," Marcus corrected quietly. "This was a post-scarcity civilization. Something destroyed all of this." As if responding to his words, the vision around them began to shift. The change was subtle at first, just a gradual dimming of the light that emanated from the plants and buildings. But then the deterioration accelerated with terrifying speed. The creatures in the garden began to move with obvious distress, their graceful motions becoming frantic as they attempted to tend to plants that were withering despite their efforts. The city's organic architecture began to calcify, losing its flowing beauty as it hardened into dead stone. The aerial vehicles fell from the sky like dying birds, while the crystal spires flickered and went dark one by one. Within minutes, the paradise they had witnessed was transforming into the barren wasteland that Kepler 442c had become. But the most disturbing aspect of the vision was what was happening to the inhabitants themselves. As their world died around them, the tall, graceful beings began to change. Their translucent limbs became fully solid, but in a way that suggested not materialization, but petrification. They were literally turning to stone, their faces frozen in expressions of profound sorrow and understanding. "They knew it was coming," Zara said, her voice barely audible. They knew their civilization was ending, and they accepted it. Why would any species simply allow themselves to die? The answer came not in words but in images that flowed directly into their minds through their contact with the device. They saw the planet's star beginning to exhibit the early signs of instability that would eventually lead to its expansion into a red giant. They witnessed the inhabitants of Kepler 442c detecting the stellar changes thousands of years before the effects would become apparent to less advanced species. And they experienced the civilization's collective decision to face extinction rather than attempt to preserve themselves through methods that would require abandoning their principles. The beings of Kepler 442c had possessed the technology to evacuate their world, to terraform new planets, to extend their lives indefinitely through artificial means. But their philosophy demanded that all life be preserved and protected, not just their own. To save themselves would have required abandoning the countless species that shared their world, creatures that could not be relocated and could not survive the stellar changes that were coming. They chose to die with their world rather than live without it. "That's insane," Marcus said, though his voice carried more awe than criticism. They had the power to preserve their entire species, and they chose extinction instead. More images flowed through the device, showing them the final phase of the civilization's existence. Rather than spending their last centuries in despair, the inhabitants had dedicated themselves to creating a legacy that would outlive their physical forms. They had embedded their consciousness, their knowledge, and their values into the very structure of their technology, creating devices that would survive the death of their civilization and continue their work of preservation and protection. The device they were touching was one of these consciousness repositories, a crystalline archive that contained not just information, but actual fragments of the personalities and motivations of its creators. It had been watching Marcus for 6 months, learning about human nature and capabilities, determining whether his species was worthy of the trust that the previous inhabitants had placed in their technological legacy. "That's why my equipment was being improved," Marcus said as understanding dawned. "You were studying me, learning what I needed to survive, testing whether humans would use advanced technology responsibly." The device pulsed with warm acknowledgement, and new images began to flow. They saw Marcus's daily routines over the past 6 months, but from a perspective that revealed details he had never noticed. Every time he had shared his limited food supplies with the small creatures that occasionally sought shelter near his compound. Every occasion when he had carefully repaired equipment rather than simply discarding it when more advanced replacements became available. Every moment when he had shown respect for the alien ruins he discovered, treating them as memorials rather than mere sources of salvage. "You were being evaluated," Zara realized. "Your entire time here has been an extended first contact scenario, and you passed the test." The vision around them shifted again, showing them not the past but potential futures. In one timeline, Kepler 442c was developed into a military research station, its archaeological treasures strip-mined for technological applications that would be used to build more powerful weapons and more efficient methods of resource extraction. The crystalline consciousness repositories were dissected in laboratory settings, their accumulated wisdom reduced to data points in weapons development programs. In another timeline, the planet became a carefully preserved archaeological site, studied by teams of researchers who approached the ruins with the same respect and reverence that the original inhabitants had shown for life itself. The consciousness repositories worked in partnership with living researchers, sharing their knowledge gradually and responsibly, helping to guide the development of galactic civilization toward the same harmony with nature that their creators had achieved. The difference between the two timelines was not technology, or resources, or military power. The difference was the character of the individuals who made first contact with the repositories. Their motivations, their values, their willingness to prioritize long-term wisdom over short-term advantage. "It's a test for our entire species," Zara said. "They're not just evaluating individuals. They're determining whether humanity as a whole is ready to inherit their knowledge." Marcus was staring at the future visions with an expression of profound responsibility.
And if we're not ready?
If we fail their evaluation, the device showed them that possibility as well. The consciousness repositories would simply shut down, becoming inert crystal formations indistinguishable from natural minerals. The technological improvements they had made to Marcus's equipment would gradually degrade back to their original specifications. All evidence of the previous civilization would wither away to nothing, leaving Kepler 442c as the lifeless rock it appeared to be. Humanity would continue to develop as a species, but without the guidance and wisdom that could help them avoid the same mistakes that had destroyed countless other civilizations throughout galactic history. They would face the same choices between preservation and exploitation, between wisdom and power, that every spacefaring species eventually encountered. And they would face those choices without the accumulated experience of a people who had achieved true harmony with their environment. "How do we prove that we're worthy?" Zara asked. "What do they need to see from us?" The answer came not as images, but as a direct transfer of understanding. The repositories didn't require grand gestures or formal demonstrations. They needed to observe how humans treated each other, how they approached problems that had no easy solutions, how they balanced individual needs against collective welfare. They needed to see whether the same compassion that had driven Marcus to rescue a stranded alien would be reflected in humanity's approach to the responsibility of stewardship over advanced alien technology. The vision began to fade, the crystalline spires and living gardens dissolving back into the familiar walls of Marcus's shelter. But the device between their hands continued to pulse with steady light, and both of them could feel that something fundamental had changed. They were no longer just two individuals trying to survive on a hostile world. They were representatives of their respective species, participants in a first contact scenario that would determine the trajectory of galactic civilization for generations to come. "Commander," Marcus said as they slowly released their contact with the device, "I think we need to talk about how we're going to handle this situation when rescue arrives." Zara nodded, her mind already working through the implications and possibilities.
The repositories are still evaluating us, aren't they?
"Every decision we make from this point forward will influence their final judgment about our species, which means we can't just wait for rescue and hope for the best. We need to actively demonstrate that humans and Altarians can work together responsibly, that we can be trusted with knowledge that could transform the galaxy." The device settled into a steady, gentle glow and became dormant once again. But both of them understood that it was still watching, still learning, still gathering the data it would need to make a decision that would echo across the centuries. Outside the shelter, the long night of Kepler, pair 442c stretched ahead of them, filled with challenges and opportunities that neither of them had imagined when they first met beside the wreckage of Zara's escape pod. They had sought each other's help for survival, but they had found something far more significant, a chance to prove that intelligence and compassion could coexist, that different species could work together for purposes greater than their individual welfare, and that the legacy of a lost civilization might live on through the choices made by those who came after. The test had begun, and the future of the galaxy hung in the balance of how well two strangers could learn to trust each other completely. 3 weeks after their first contact with the repository device, Zara and Marcus had established a routine that balanced survival necessities with their growing understanding of the civilization that had once flourished on Kepler. 442c. Each morning, they would spend several hours maintaining the shelter systems and gathering resources from the surrounding landscape. The afternoons were dedicated to careful exploration of the archaeological sites Marcus had discovered, with Zara applying her Survey Corps training to document and analyze their findings. Evenings were reserved for working with the crystalline device, learning to communicate more effectively with the consciousness fragments it contained. What they discovered during those evening sessions was both inspiring and terrifying. The repositories held not just the accumulated knowledge of a single species, but the wisdom of dozens of civilizations that had achieved various levels of harmony with their environments before ultimately failing to survive the challenges of long-term existence. The beings of Kepler. 442c had been students of extinction, collecting the final communications and cultural artifacts of dying species throughout their region of the galaxy.
It's like a library of last words, Zara said as they finished their latest communication session.
The device had shared memories from a aquatic species that had achieved perfect sustainable technology before being destroyed by a gamma-ray burst from their system's binary star. Every species that reaches a certain level of development faces the same fundamental choice: adapt to long-term survival or optimize for short-term expansion. Most choose expansion. Marcus was studying readouts from the atmospheric processor, which had been running with impossible efficiency since their first contact with the repositories. And the ones that choose adaptation? They survive until something beyond their control kills them anyway. Stellar evolution, cosmic disasters, encounters with species that made different choices. Zara gestured toward the device, which had remained active and responsive since their initial contact. The repositories were created by the survivors, not the failures. They represent the accumulated wisdom of species that solved the fundamental problem of sustainable civilization. Their conversations had taken on a depth and complexity that surprised both of them. Marcus's military background provided him with insights into resource allocation and strategic thinking that complemented Zara's scientific training perfectly. More importantly, their different species' perspectives allowed them to identify assumptions and biases that neither would have recognized alone. "There's something I need to tell you," Marcus said, setting down his datapad and looking directly at her. "The modifications to our equipment aren't just improvements anymore. This morning I found new devices, things that definitely weren't here yesterday." Zara felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of devices?" Marcus led her to a section of the shelter she hadn't visited in several days. Where there had once been empty space, a new room had been constructed, using materials and techniques that resembled the architecture they had seen in the vision of the ancient city. The walls curved organically, glowing with soft phosphorescence that provided perfect illumination without generating heat. In the center of the room sat two chairs that seemed to have grown from the floor itself, positioned around a table that supported the most sophisticated communication array Zara had ever seen.
"They built this overnight," Marcus said.
"I went to sleep in a 3-room shelter and woke up in what's essentially a small embassy." Zara examined the construction more closely, running her hands over surfaces that felt warm and somehow alive despite being obviously technological. "The repositories are accelerating their timeline. They're preparing for formal contact. That's what I'm afraid of. Commander, I've been thinking about what happens when rescue arrives. Best case scenario, it's a Survey Corps vessel with a scientific crew that will approach this situation with appropriate caution. Worst case, it's a Colonial Command battleship with orders to secure any alien technology for military analysis." The implications were sobering. If Zara's rescue came in the form of military intervention, the repositories would witness humanity's first response to their offer of knowledge and partnership. That response would determine whether the consciousness fragments chose to continue their evaluation or simply shut down permanently. "We need to ensure that first contact happens on our terms," Zara said. "The repositories need to see that we can approach their technology with respect and wisdom, not just acquisitive curiosity."
Agreed.
"But how do we control the circumstances of first contact when we don't even know who's coming or when they'll arrive?" The answer came from an unexpected source. As they stood in the new room discussing their options, the communication array activated spontaneously. The display screens flickered to life, showing star charts and trajectory calculations that Zara recognized immediately. "That's the approach vector for this system," she said, studying the data with growing excitement. "Something's coming, and it'll arrive within the next 48 hours. Marcus was examining other displays that showed detailed sensor readings of the approaching vessel. Survey Corps configuration, but with military escort. 3 ships total, including what looks like a heavy cruiser. Zara felt her heart sink. A military escort suggested that her disappearance had been classified as a potential security issue rather than a simple rescue operation. The first contact scenario they had been trying to prepare for was about to become much more complicated. The repositories are monitoring interstellar communications, she realized. Why dancing SAP's ability to display new information ways? Here, and their likely responses to various first contacts. He dancing SAP's ability to display new information. The communication array shifted to display new information. He detailed profiles of the 3 ship captains, their service records, their psychological evaluations, and their likely. The data was incredibly comprehensive, drawn from sources that should have been classified at the highest levels of galactic security. They're not just monitoring communications, Marcus said, studying the personnel files with growing amazement. They have access to military databases, psychological profiles, strategic planning documents. They know more about the incoming rescue mission than we do. Zara was examining the psychological profiles of the ship commanders, looking for indicators of how they might respond to the discovery of advanced alien technology. What she found was both encouraging and concerning. Captain Sarah Chen of the Survey Corps vessel Resolution had an exemplary record of handling first contact situations with appropriate scientific rigor. But Admiral James Morrison of the military escort was known for his aggressive approach to alien technology acquisition, and his service record included several incidents where archaeological sites had been strip-mined for military applications. "We have a problem," she said. "The military commander has a history of treating alien artifacts as weapons to be acquired, rather than knowledge to be studied. If he takes control of the first contact situation, then the repositories will shut down, and humanity will have failed its first major test as a spacefaring civilization," Marcus finished. "We need to make sure that Captain Chen maintains command authority over the archaeological aspects of this mission." The communication array flickered again, displaying what appeared to be detailed operational plans for the incoming rescue mission. According to the classified documents it was showing them, Admiral Morrison had orders to secure any alien technology discovered on Kepler 442c and transfer it to a military research facility for analysis and potential weaponization. "This is intelligence that could get people killed," Marcus said, reading through the operational parameters. "The repositories are showing us military secrets that no civilian should have access to. They're also showing us how to prevent a diplomatic disaster," Zara replied. "If we know the Admiral's intentions in advance, we can prepare countermeasures." The array shifted once more, displaying what looked like a detailed tactical analysis of various first contact scenarios. In most of the projections, Admiral Morrison's aggressive approach led to the repositories withdrawing all cooperation and the archaeological sites becoming permanently inaccessible. But in a few scenarios, careful management of the initial contact phase resulted in productive cooperation between the military authorities and the alien consciousness fragments. "The repositories want to succeed," Zara said, studying the tactical projections. "They're not just evaluating us passively. They're actively trying to help us pass their test by giving us the information we need to manage the situation properly." Marcus was examining schematics that showed detailed floor plans of all 3 incoming ships, including security protocols and crew rotation schedules. "Commander, they're giving us everything we need to stage a perfect first contact scenario. They want us to succeed so badly that they're essentially cheating on our behalf. Or they're teaching us that successful diplomacy requires complete information and careful preparation. The consciousness fragments come from species that survived long enough to develop wisdom about interspecies cooperation. Maybe what we're seeing isn't cheating, but education in how to handle situations like this responsibly." The communication array went dormant, leaving them with more classified intelligence about the incoming rescue mission than either of them had any right to possess. But it also left them with a clear understanding of what they needed to do in the next 48 hours. "We need to prepare the site for controlled first contact," Zara said. "The repositories need to see that we can manage a complex diplomatic situation responsibly, even when it involves competing interests and potential conflicts." Marcus was already moving toward the equipment lockers, his military training evident in the efficiency with which he began gathering materials. "I can prepare the archaeological sites to showcase the most impressive discoveries while keeping the consciousness repositories secure until we're certain about the visitors' intentions. I'll work on preparing a presentation that emphasizes the scientific and cultural value of the discoveries while downplaying their potential military applications," Zara added. "If Captain Chen maintains scientific authority over the mission, we can guide the first contact process appropriately." They worked through the night, preparing for what might be the most important first contact scenario in galactic history. The repositories watched silently, their crystalline forms pulsing with gentle light as they observed two individuals from different species working together to protect the legacy of a civilization that had died 10,000 years before either of them was born. By morning, they had transformed the shelter into something that was part archaeological research station, part diplomatic embassy, and part demonstration of what could be achieved when different species worked together toward common goals. The consciousness repositories were secured but accessible, ready to participate in first contact if the circumstances proved favorable. "Zara," Marcus said as they finished their preparations, using her personal name for the first time since they had met. "Whatever happens when those ships arrive, I want you to know that these past few weeks have been the most meaningful of my life. Not just because we survived, but because we proved that it's possible for complete strangers to become family." She reached out with one of her secondary hands and took his fingers in what had become a familiar gesture of mutual support. "Marcus, I think that's exactly what the repositories needed to see. Not grand speeches about interspecies cooperation, but simple proof that different kinds of people can care about each other's welfare more than their own." Outside the shelter, the sky of Kepler 442c was beginning to show the first traces of the aurora that preceded the arrival of ships dropping out of hyperspace. The rescue mission was arriving ahead of schedule, and in a few hours the careful balance they had built between survival and discovery would be tested by the realities of galactic politics and military priorities. But they faced that test together, united not just by the circumstances that had brought them to this world, but by the understanding that they were part of something much larger than their individual survival. They were the bridge between the wisdom of the past and the possibilities of the future, and everything they had learned from each other would determine whether that bridge could bear the weight of first contact between living civilizations. The rescue ships descended through Kepler 442c's thin atmosphere with the precision that marked experienced military crews, their formation carefully arranged to project both capability and restraint. Zara and Marcus watched from the observation deck of their transformed shelter as the three vessels settled onto the landing field that Marcus had cleared months earlier for exactly this possibility. The Resolution, Captain Chen's Survey Corps vessel, touched down first with the gentle precision of a ship designed for scientific missions. The two military escorts, Admiral Morrison's heavy cruiser Determination and the destroyer Vigilance, flanked it with the obvious efficiency of warships that had seen active service. Even from a distance, the message was clear. This was both a rescue mission and a potential military operation. "Remember," Zara said as they prepared to greet their rescuers, "the repositories are still watching and evaluating. Every interaction from this point forward will influence their final decision about whether to trust our species with their knowledge." Marcus checked the tactical display one final time, confirming that all of their preparations were in place. "The consciousness devices are secured but accessible. If Captain Chen maintains scientific authority, we can guide the first contact appropriately. If Admiral Morrison takes over, then we improvise and hope that the repositories recognize the difference between individual choices and species-wide character." They walked together toward the landing field, crossing ground that had become as familiar to them as their own homes during the weeks they had worked side by side. Behind them, the shelter that had grown from a simple survival structure into a sophisticated research station stood as testament to what could be achieved when different species combined their strengths and trusted each other completely. The airlock of the Resolution cycled open as they approached, and Captain Sarah Chen emerged wearing the standard environmental suit of Survey Corps personnel. She was a woman in her 40s, with the kind of composed competence that marked successful deep space commanders, and her first action was to scan both Zara and Marcus with a medical sensor to confirm their health status. "Commander Thex Valen," she said, her voice carrying obvious relief. "Survey Corps Command classified you as missing and presumed dead after the Prosperity's Dawn disaster. It's good to see you alive and apparently well." "Thank you, Captain Chen. May I introduce Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen of the Colonial Marines. He's been instrumental in my survival on this world." Captain Chen's eyebrows rose slightly as she processed the shared surname, but she extended her hand to Marcus in the traditional human gesture of greeting. "Sergeant Chen, your presence here raises some interesting questions, but those can wait until after we've ensured everyone's safety." Admiral Morrison emerged from the Determination with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he had already made decisions about how this situation would be handled. He was a tall, imposing man whose environmental suit bore the additional armor and weapon systems that marked him as someone who expected to encounter hostility in first contact situations. "Commander Thex Valen, Sergeant Chen," he said without preamble. "I'm Admiral Morrison, commanding the escort element of this mission. I understand you've been alone on this world for an extended period. Have you encountered any indigenous life forms or discovered any artifacts of potential significance?" Zara felt Marcus tense beside her at the Admiral's aggressive approach, but she maintained her diplomatic composure. Admiral, this world has proven to be archaeologically significant beyond anything suggested by the preliminary surveys. I believe Captain Chen's scientific expertise will be essential in properly evaluating what we've discovered. That's precisely why I'm here, Admiral, Captain Chen added smoothly. Survey Corps protocols require that all archaeological discoveries be properly documented and analyzed before any other considerations come into play. Admiral Morrison's expression suggested that he had different priorities, but before he could respond, the communication array in the distant shelter activated with a pulse of light that was visible even from their current location. All three of the newcomers turned toward the phenomenon with obvious surprise. "What was that?" Captain Chen asked. "That," Marcus replied carefully, "is why this conversation needs to happen somewhere with better security protocols. Captain, Admiral, would you be willing to accompany us to our research station? There are aspects of this situation that require immediate attention." The group made their way across the rocky terrain toward the shelter, with Captain Chen asking technical questions about survival strategies, while Admiral Morrison maintained a tactical scan of their surroundings. As they approached the transformed structure, both newcomers slowed their pace, clearly recognizing that what they were seeing was far more sophisticated than any emergency shelter should have been. "Sergeant Chen," Admiral Morrison said, his voice carefully controlled, "how did you construct a facility of this complexity with limited resources?" "With help, Admiral. A great deal of help from sources that I believe will be very interested in meeting you." They entered the main chamber of the shelter, where the organic architecture and advanced technology created an environment that was obviously not entirely human in origin. Captain Chen immediately began scanning the walls and equipment with her scientific instruments, while Admiral Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm. "Gentlemen, Commander," Zara said, activating the communication array with a gesture, "I'd like you to meet the previous inhabitants of this world." The array came to life with patterns of light and sound that gradually resolved into recognizable communication protocols. The consciousness repositories had been monitoring the new arrivals since their ships entered the system, and they were ready to make formal contact. But rather than overwhelming the newcomers with the full scope of their capabilities, they began with simple mathematical sequences and basic linguistic patterns. Captain Chen responded immediately, recognizing the significance of what she was witnessing. "This is active communication with an alien intelligence. Protocol requires that I establish a complete quarantine of this site until we can properly evaluate the situation." Admiral Morrison had a different reaction. "Captain, protocol requires that I secure any alien technology that poses a potential threat to human interests. Sergeant, I need a complete briefing on the capabilities and intentions of these entities." "Admiral," Marcus replied carefully, "the entities you're concerned about have been observing human behavior for months. They're not a threat that can be secured through military action. They're a test that humanity needs to pass through wisdom and cooperation." The communication array shifted to display star charts showing the locations of dozens of dead civilizations throughout the local galactic region. Each world was marked with symbols indicating the cause of its civilization's extinction: resource depletion, environmental collapse, military expansion, failure to adapt to cosmic disasters. The pattern was unmistakable and terrifying. "They're showing us the fate of species that failed to develop sustainable approaches to existence," Zara explained. The consciousness repositories were created by civilizations that succeeded, at least temporarily, in solving the fundamental problems of long-term survival. Captain Chen was studying the displays with obvious fascination. "The archaeological implications are staggering. We're looking at a comprehensive database of galactic civilizations spanning thousands of years. We're looking at potential intelligence resources that could provide significant strategic advantages," Admiral Morrison corrected. "Captain, I need immediate access to these databases for evaluation of their military applications." The communication array flickered and displayed new information, detailed analyses of both officers based on psychological profiles, service records, and observed behavior patterns. The repositories had been evaluating both newcomers since their arrival, determining which of them represented humanity's best response to the offer of alien knowledge. Captain Chen's profile showed a lifetime of careful scientific work, ethical decision-making, and respect for alien cultures. Admiral Morrison's record was more complex, showing tactical brilliance and genuine concern for human welfare, but also a tendency to prioritize short-term security over long-term wisdom. "They're evaluating all of us," Marcus said. "The repositories need to determine whether humanity is ready to inherit the knowledge of species that achieve true sustainability, and what happens if we fail their evaluation. Admiral Morrison asked, his military mind immediately grasping the strategic implications. The array shifted to show the timeline of civilizations that had encountered repository technology. Most had failed the evaluation process by attempting to acquire the knowledge through force, or by prioritizing military applications over wisdom and understanding. In every case, the repositories had simply shut down, leaving the failed civilizations to face their evolutionary challenges without guidance. The test isn't about military strength or technological capability, Zara explained. It's about character. The repositories need to see that we can work together across species lines, that we can prioritize long-term welfare over short-term advantage, and that we can approach alien knowledge with respect rather than merely acquisitive curiosity. Captain Chen was beginning to understand the scope of what they were facing. This isn't just a first contact situation. It's a civilization-level evaluation that will determine humanity's trajectory for generations to come. Admiral Morrison studied the displays for several long moments, his expression reflecting the internal struggle between his military training and his growing recognition of the situation's significance. What do they need to see from us? What would constitute passing their test? The answer came directly from the repositories, transmitted through the communication array in words that appeared in all of their native languages simultaneously. Demonstrate that wisdom can guide strength. Show that different species can work as one family. Prove that knowledge will be used to preserve rather than destroy. They want to see the same thing that Zara and I discovered during our time together, Marcus said. That survival isn't just about individual strength or even species superiority. It's about building relationships based on trust and mutual support. Admiral Morrison looked at the evidence of cooperation that surrounded them. The hybrid human-Altarian research techniques, the technology that had been carefully studied rather than simply exploited, the obvious bond of trust and friendship that had developed between two complete strangers. Slowly, his hand moved away from his weapon. Captain Chen, he said formally, I'm transferring operational authority over the site to survey core protocols. This situation requires scientific and diplomatic expertise that exceeds military parameters. The communication array brightened with obvious approval, and new information began flowing through the displays. Technical schematics, historical databases, and philosophical treatises from dozens of extinct civilizations became available for study. But more importantly, the repositories began sharing practical knowledge, sustainable energy systems, environmental restoration techniques, and social structures that could support long-term civilization without depleting their resource base. They're not just giving us information, Captain Chen said, studying the flood of data with amazement. They're providing a complete educational curriculum for evolving into a sustainable civilization. Because we proved that we can learn from each other, Zara added. Marcus and I didn't just survive on this world. We created a partnership that demonstrated the principles the repositories were looking for. Over the following hours, as more personnel from the rescue ships joined them in the shelter, the scope of humanity's new relationship with the repositories became clear. This was not a simple transfer of technology, but the beginning of a mentorship relationship with the accumulated wisdom of multiple successful civilizations. The knowledge would be shared gradually, as humanity demonstrated its ability to use each new understanding responsibly. Admiral Morrison proved instrumental in establishing security protocols that protected the repositories while allowing for proper scientific study. Captain Chen began organizing research teams that would study the alien knowledge with appropriate reverence and care. Most importantly, both officers worked together to ensure that the first contact process became a model for how different perspectives and priorities could be reconciled through mutual respect and common purpose. As the sun set over Kepler 442c on what would be their last night together on the planet, Zara and Marcus stood once again on the observation deck of what had become the galaxy's first interspecies research station. The rescue ships were being converted into permanent facilities, and both Survey Corps and Colonial Command were already sending additional personnel to participate in the ongoing first contact process. We did it, Marcus said quietly. We actually did it. We proved that different species can become family, Zara replied, taking his hand in the gesture that had become their symbol of partnership and trust. We showed them that wisdom and strength can coexist, and that knowledge can be used to preserve rather than destroy. Behind them, the communication array pulsed with gentle light as the repositories continued their patient work of education, sharing the accumulated wisdom of ages with a species that had finally proven itself worthy of that trust. The test was over, and humanity had passed not through grand gestures or demonstrations of power, but through the simple proof that two individuals could care more about each other's welfare than their own survival. The galaxy was about to change in ways that no one could fully predict. But the foundation for that change had been built by a stranded commander and a lost soldier who had discovered that the most powerful force in the universe was not technology or weapons or knowledge, but the willingness to reach out and take a stranger's hand when they needed help the most. In the years that followed, their story would be told throughout human and Altarian space as the legend of how first contact began, not with diplomats or scientists or military commanders, but with two people who had learned that survival meant never allowing anyone to face the darkness alone. And on Kepler 442c, now renamed Haven, in honor of what it had become, the consciousness repositories continued their work, teaching a galaxy how to build civilizations that could last forever because they were founded on the simple understanding that everyone deserves to be helped, to be protected, and to be loved.